we're going to be starting to apply the Dichroic extract, and what that is the same thing that's on dichroic glass, but it's been removed to the from the glass so that it's just the dichroic metals in a powder form. And this dichro being in that form just loosens it up to be applied in a lot of other ways, and it's already been crystallized to a point where it's really pretty durable. It's actually hard to burn out in this state. So the first thing I'm going to do, I found if I use a little bit of liquid stringer fused master, that just ends up creating a little bit of a glue against the glass for the dichro to actually stick to. I have just used water in the past, but then I have problems with it becoming too loose and flying off in the air. And all I'm doing is putting probably less than a drop on the end of that paintbrush. And now I'm going to go ahead and dilute that just a little bit more, even with some water, so that I can spread it out evenly and not end up with it all in one spot. And when I'm doing an image that actually has quite a bit of surface and it's pretty much broken into these 3 different parts, just so I don't end up starting in one spot and have a bunch right there and not a bunch in other little areas, I'm going to go ahead and add a little water to this. What I'm going to do is just add a little dab here and there all around the whole image, and that'll keep it evenly spread. So I'm going to add just a little bit more water to that, and all I'm looking for is just to get a real thin amount of that in those grooves so that it'll grab onto the dichro. And if you go overboard with this stuff and get too much, it actually will create bubbling problems later for you. And it's just a good rule of thumb to get the absolute minimum you need on there, which is, as you can see, just barely getting it wet with it. Okay, now that I can tell I've got the whole thing, make sure, actually it looks a little light in a few of these spots. You actually do want to make sure you get all those little areas. Okay. So now that I've covered the entire surface area of my image, what I'm going to do is just pretty much spackle across that with a business card. And I just like those because they're in everybody's pocket, and they actually do make a really nice straight edge on the side of that. So all I'm going to do is actually put quite a bit of pressure and scrape across that, and what that's doing ideally is scraping off any excess liquid stringer medium from the edges, and you're just ending up with it left in those cracks. I like to wipe off the edge in between. Okay, now we're ready to start applying some Dichroic extract. This is red silver medium grain. I'm actually just going to add a few drops of water just by soaking some up onto a brush, dabbing onto the end of my jar or whatever you have for a container. And it doesn't take much, just enough to, you can see it's starting to loosen back up in that water. So silver is going to be my base coat that's going to cover the most broad area of this image. So I'm going to apply that first. You can be conscious of loading your brush with the amount that you want. And just kind of don't really worry about getting in the lines, because it's all going to be scraped off and saved later. So you actually can just kind of push it around wherever, and then when we spackle across it, it's going to be evened out. sure you're covering it. And I'm sure you can see, like when I even rub across it with a brush, it's already starting to fall just in those lines. So I got my skull covered enough. Just go along the sides. Add a little bit more and just kind of make sure you're pushing it around into those grooves. Okay, and just to give that color a little more wink, what I'm going to be adding to it is some green gold long grain. And the difference between medium and long grain, and I have a fine grain also, is just with the size of the actual speck of metal. The medium grain is obviously smaller than the large grain, and the large grain just gives you a larger surface area to create a bigger wink. But I found that if you put the long grain everywhere in your image, it's actually so sparkly that it's hard to define your lines in your image. So I like to do a base coat with a medium grain, and you could equivalent that with like a medium sparkle, so that you can, that's defining the lines, and then by spreading out a little bit of the long grain in that, you get the definition of your image and a little bit of twinkle here and there, just giving it that other Dichro action. So I'm going to add a little bit of water. And when I'm doing this, I'm not really as concerned about spreading it everywhere, because I know all those lines are filled. I just want to get it here and there, and then when I scrape across that, it'll actually even it out. And I actually like to put more of it at the top, because we're going to be scraping down as I'm spackling across that. So if there's a little more at the top and it doesn't end up in those grooves, it'll just get drugged down into grooves further down. And I'm just going to do this 1/3 of the image at a time. As far as while I'm scraping across this, I actually do want that Dichro to be not wet but moist, just so any Dichro that doesn't end up in a groove will end up on the end of your card, and you can actually just peel it off with your paintbrush, versus if I let that all the way dry and tried to scrape across it, whatever Dichro doesn't end up in those grooves just ends up foofing off into the air. So it's just a good rule of thumb to try and conserve as much Dichro as you can. I have my Dichro applied. I'm going to go ahead and bend my card so that it actually kind of fits the curvature of that tube enough that when I scrape across that, I have those sides to keep me up out of the sandblasted areas. And you will end up with a little line of it at the bottom, and that becomes easy to save because it's all in one spot. So now before I go on to scraping off this area, I need to add a little bit more Dichro. And I just break that into thirds because it's difficult to keep all of it moist enough that it's ideal for spackling. I need to figure out a good term for that one of these days here. Spackling seems to make sense.
Yeah.
That's the easiest way I'd relate it when I would be trying to explain the technique to people. As far as what I would do is ask them if they've ever spackled a crack of drywall in their wall. It's basically the same thing. You're forming a mud, you're over applying it over that crack, and then by spackling across it, it ends up just in the grooves.